Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, beautiful people of LinkedIn and also of YouTube. How are you doing? Yeah, I'm flying solo this morning. And the reason being, I've got a tricky topic. And sometimes when I have guests on here, well, actually, most of the time when I have guests on here, they don't want to talk about politics, right? For good reason, often. So I'm always like a little bit wary. Sometimes some of the conversations do go into politics, but most of the time they don't. They don't want to talk about politics. And we know that as a platform in particular, LinkedIn is not keen on political conversations. So it's sometimes quite hard actually to even talk about these topics and get into any advice around how to navigate these topics without the conversation potentially getting political, right? So that's why I thought, you know what, I'm going to do this as a solo. I'm going to actually just talk about this because this is something I talk about a lot offline, but not particularly online. So good morning. If you are watching this live, please do say good morning in the comments. If you are watching this live on YouTube or on LinkedIn. If you do have any questions, because I'm conscious that I might touch on a couple of topics that you want to ask a question about, but you don't want it to be public. You don't want it to be on LinkedIn. You know, your boss might be watching, or somebody might be watching, and you maybe don't want to say it in public. Please do feel free to send me a DM, but maybe put in the comments that you sent me a DM, because otherwise I'm going to be constantly checking more than one device. So if you want to send me a question and you want to do it anonymously, just drop me a comment to say, I'm DMing you a question, and then DM me the question, and then I can pick it up from there. So that's how I'm going to run this. So good morning. I hope you have all had an amazing week. Part of the reason that I have wanted to talk about this topic, I wanted to talk about this for a little while actually, and I'll tell you for why. So we ran the ERG summit here in London a couple of months ago now. So we ran it in June. Thank you to everybody that came along to the summit. One of the bits of feedback that we had in our survey, and also I picked up on this feedback from conversations with a friend, were that people sometimes felt that some of the content got a little bit political, right? I'm just going to use those terms. And it made me really think about it. And this is something that I have spoken about before on LinkedIn. I ran a poll, some of you may remember, and I asked, do you tend to avoid political conversations at work? Because it was something I'd come across. And something like about 50% of people, so half and half, 50% of people, like in my poll anyway, right, very scientific, but I did have quite a few hundred respond, said that they tend to avoid political conversations at work. And then I guess you have another half that are like, we don't mind. And in the comments, certainly, people are like, oh, it's a shame if actually we can't talk about politics. So I thought, let me tackle this topic. And I have done a similar LinkedIn Live before about how to disagree respectfully. But this morning, I'm specifically talking about politics and how you navigate political conversations at work. I'm wearing my t-shirt. The t-shirt that I'm wearing this morning is Be Kind, right? Because I think there is something about, as you go into these conversations, there is an element of being kind, both to ourselves, but also obviously to the individuals that we are having the conversations with. So the first step, or the first tip that I'm going to be leaving you with in terms of if conversations start to get political at work, and there is a lot going on, particularly if you are in the US or in the UK, where I'm based, there is a lot of conversations at the moment. There are a lot of political issues. There is a lot of conflict. So as part of this conversation, I'm also picking up on things like geopolitical conflicts and war, etc. So good morning, Junior. Good morning. Let's get into this spicy topic. I'm ready. Do you know what? I feel like I do need a cup of tea as well. It is a very spicy topic. If you've got any specific questions, Junior, please do let me know. And just to say as well, I am going to be, as a follow-up to this, because there's only so much I can do on a LinkedIn Live in kind of like 30 to 40 minutes in the morning. But as a follow-up to this, I am going to be doing specific advice that goes into more of the topics for specific employee network leaders or ERG leaders on my YouTube channel. So on YouTube, I will be going into specific topics and really getting into the nuts and bolts of what are some of the political arguments, where do people sit on both sets of the divide, and if you are an ERG leader, how you can better navigate that. But on LinkedIn here this morning, I'm just going to be sort of like talking more broadly. So the first tip that I'm going to leave you with, before you get into political conversations, make friends with people, as in, what I'm saying is, right, don't be getting into political conversations on the first meeting. At least that would be my advice. Now, some of you might be saying, well, it's difficult because, maybe I've met somebody for the first time and they want to take it there, right? They want the conversation to go there. So if that is the case, and this advice is going to sort of feed across quite a few of the tips and strategies that I've got, you need to have a form of words that is going to work for you to basically be able to moonwalk back out of the conversation, to be able to exit the conversation politely if you don't want to go there. And the reason I'm saying that you should really get to know people first before you get into politics is because when you don't know people, when you're not friends with them, etc., when you have no sort of relationship with them, it's very easy for these conversations to go south very quickly, as in to become very antagonistic, very confrontational, and just leave everybody with a bad experience. So some of the things that you might want to say, and obviously, you need to come up with your own words that you kind of have in your back pocket ready. You could say something like, I don't do politics on a first meeting, or, let's get to know each other and then we can fall out over politics later, right? So those are the sorts of things I would say, because I tend to almost like use a little bit of humor just to get out of what could potentially be an awkward conversation. You could say something like, I'm having a no politics day today, so please go and park that topic until we next meet, or until we know each other a little bit better. So that's one of the ways that you can kind of almost just like back out of having a conversation about a very tricky or sensitive topic before you actually know somebody. And the reason I think this is important, so just for a little bit of context, if you know me and you've been following me for a little while on LinkedIn, you will know that in terms of politics, so just sharing with you a little bit of my politics, I guess I would say I sit slightly left of centre, right, in terms of my politics and my attitudes generally. I'm actually probably quite far left on some things. And my husband, who I've been married to for many, 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 many years, I won't say how many because you'll be shocked at how long I've been married, a long time. I got married very young. I was 19 when I got married. We'll save that for another LinkedIn Live. But suffice to say, I've been married for a long time. My husband sits slightly right of centre. Right, so left of centre, right of centre. Good morning, Hardev. Hope you are well. So I have been married to somebody who, we have slightly different political views on quite a lot of things. And actually some things we have very, very different views. And also, just to throw it into the mix, my husband is also quite religious. Now, I used to be, many, many years ago, I grew up in the faith. I lost my faith kind of like, in my sort of like early 20s. And so I have been very much used to living with somebody that has very different political, religious views than me over a lot of things. Good morning, Andrea. Hope you are well. I'm seeing all the ERG leaders in the comments. Love it, love it, love it. And as I said before, I am going to be doing separate videos specifically for different types of ERG. So I'm going to be doing one for LGBTQ plus leads, multicultural leads, gender network leads, etc. I'm going to be going into more depth, but in this LinkedIn Live, I'm just covering general. So I think because I've been living with somebody who has had very different views, it's really taught me a lot in terms of how to navigate some of these tricky conversations. And yeah, suffice to say, sometimes our dinner tables we have some quite interesting conversations, and also when we're on holiday. lying on a beach talking about sort of like various things. We have interesting conversations, but it's taught me a lot in terms of how to navigate it. And I think it's what has made me so interested in this as a topic. And so that's why my first tip is ideally get to know somebody and get to like them if possible as well, before you then go into the politics. You'd be amazed how much you can find to have in common with them and how much of a friend you can create, you know, if you kind of like leave the politics until later. But I do want to get into, I want to kind of like keep it real, right? I want to keep it real. I don't want to just like have my rose tinted glasses on. So how about, you know, if you do meet somebody for the first time, or you're in a meeting setting, say, for example, in work, or you overhear something and somebody says something that's hurtful, right, or offensive, or you think it crosses the line, what do you do then? Do you just ignore it? I mean, I guess, you know, you've got a couple of options, but again, this is where you need to come up with a form of words that works for you. Something that you could say, you know, you could say, look, you know, I respect your right to have an opinion. At the same time, this is how that comment made me feel. Or if, for example, if that comment was directed towards somebody else, so say, for example, you overheard something, again, you could say, you know, respect, you know, your right to have an opinion. You've got those opinions. At the same time, hearing that, for me, that comment crossed the line, and you could say, you know, and this is why. And you can do that. You can do that without any judgment, you know, so without any judgment on that person, without sort of saying, I disagree with you because of X, Y, and Z. You can just sort of say, look, you know, you have your opinions, and that's absolutely fine. But this is how, you know, that comment made me feel. And this is why I think, you know, that type of comment maybe isn't appropriate for the workplace. And I'm not talking here about things that are clearly, you know, kind of like hate speech, you know, sexist, racist, transphobic, homophobic, etc. Things like that. And hopefully in your workplace, I'm hoping that you have clear guidelines around things that absolutely are unacceptable in terms of your harassment and bullying policy. If you don't, and if those guidelines need updating, then that is definitely something to be talking with your HR colleagues and or your inclusion and belonging or culture leads, because those kinds of things should be crystal clear. I was doing a workshop very recently. I don't want to say how recently, because otherwise the organisation may know, but you know, they have, for example, an online virtual community channel, you know, things like sort of Slack, Viva Engage, etc. is the kind of thing I'm talking about. And they have virtually zero moderation on that channel and very little by way of community guidelines and policies. My advice, if you have something like that and people are effectively getting what I would almost like consider to be hate speech, or they're getting harassment, or, you know, very unkind things are being said, a really good place actually to look at in terms of what is or isn't acceptable is actually here on LinkedIn. So the LinkedIn community policy and guidelines are actually quite useful in terms of just setting some ground rules around what is and isn't respectful, acceptable behavior, etc. Those of you that came along to the ERG Leader Summit, you would have always also come across an organization called Swoop. Swoop Analytics do work with Viva Engage around things like this. And actually, Gemma Saint from Swoop does actually have a blog post, which I will share, which is around guidelines. So guidelines for things like online speech. This is for internal. So if you use like internal platforms, etc., making sure that people stay safe and aren't disrespected. Okay, so let's get into if a political conversation comes up, and at the moment we've got a plethora of them, right? Because of all of the issues that are going on at the moment, we've got anti-immigration protests, we have got the UK Supreme Court ruling, and more further guidance that's going to be coming out on top of the interim guidance and the update to the interim guidance and all of that. And then we've got, you know, we've got Gaza and Palestine, and Israel and the war, and we've got Ukraine, and we've got, you know, there is a lot going on. So actually, if these conversations come up and somebody thinks actually we need to create space to hear some of these conversations and, you know, let people say what they're thinking, what they're feeling, how do you navigate that? And it's really interesting because I've had many conversations about this week. And one of the things that I would say, one of the conversations I had with an inclusion colleague of mine, so a DI practitioner, I said, for me, do you know, one of the things that I wish as a profession, the DEI profession, the inclusion profession, one of the things I wish we were better at is holding space for difference. And this was something that came up on a LinkedIn Live I did a couple of months ago, and it's a phrase that I'm borrowing. And I think, yeah, we're not always great, I think, sometimes when we're in this work at recognizing that it is okay for people to have different opinions as long as they are held and shared in a way that's respectful to others, right? Sometimes I think we just have a view of, there's only one right side of history, and if you're not on that right side of history, you're dead to me, kind of thing, right? And it can't be as straightforward as that. So how about if there is a political conversation or a difference of opinions, right? And it maybe comes up at work, whether it's just in a conversation with colleagues, or it comes up in, for example, if you're running an employee network, maybe it comes up in a committee meeting that you've got, right? Or at an event, somebody comes up with different views. So you have a couple of options, but one of the places that I want to start with is really listening. So leaning in and actually listening to what is being said and why. And where I'm going to start with, there are so many quotes about this that I could potentially share, but I'm going to start first with one, which is listen first to understand and then respond. And sometimes I would actually question whether you even need to respond. So I start with you listen first to understand. And by that, I don't just mean that you look and nod and smile and nod. I mean, you ask them questions. You ask them open questions. So, what are your views on that? What, and why do you hold those views? What is it in terms of your own experiences that have led to you holding those particular views? Tell me about how you came to those conclusions. What is the data, etc., that maybe swayed you to think like that? Did you always think like that? What is the data, etc.? Ask them questions. And I would say, actually, sometimes, and it depends on the situation, but sometimes it's useful to just have a session where you are just listening. And you can say to yourself, actually, especially if this is somebody that you know quite well, or it's in, say, for example, a forum where you know that there's going to be a follow-up, right? You could say, actually, okay, let's just take 5 minutes to just hear that person out, and let's just understand why they think that way. And then maybe next time we'll have a think and we'll come back and we'll listen to another perspective, because there is not always time to get into all sides and all nuances of a political debate. So actually breaking it down sometimes and just asking one person to go into why they think what they think, that in itself is a useful exercise. And that might be fine for that conversation that day. And then the next day, or the next, in the next meeting, then you kind of like flip it and say, okay, let's look at this from a different angle. So seeking first to understand is really important. Listening, asking questions. And then, as I said in the post for this particular LinkedIn Live, when you hear, so when you ask a question and you hear, playing it back to the person that has answered and given that view actually really improves the listening. And just cognitively for us, it means that we're actually more likely to take it in and to be thinking about it rather than, thinking about our response. Then in terms of listening to people, I want us to be really careful of biases, right? Because we all have biases in different ways. Unconscious bias training has been totally butchered over the last few years. That's all I'm going to say about that. But we all have different biases. One of the biases that we all have is confirmation bias, right? We all know what that is. That basically means we tend to look for evidence that supports what we believe, and we tend to ignore evidence that contradicts what we believe. Now, I have a really good friend. I'm not going to say who she is and embarrass her, but if she's watching this, she will know. And she always used to say to me, we should always look for evidence that disproves what we think. And she said this was years and years and years ago when we worked together, like many, many years ago. but it just always stuck with me. And there's been some really tricky topics that I can share with you where I've done exactly this. And the one that I'm going to share with you actually is around sex and gender. And you can see that it makes me physically uncomfortable, right? Because I'm moving around in my chair. But I remember being contacted here on LinkedIn probably about 18 months ago by somebody. They're no longer on LinkedIn, so you won't be able to find them. That's probably another story in itself. But I remember being contacted about a post that I had done. I'd done a post around gender neutral toilets. Uh, and some like 6 months later, somebody commented on that post. And it was about 6 months old. And I was like, this is so random. Why is somebody commenting on that particular post? And I can't, had to look at the person, had to look at the comments, and then got a sense of, okay, I understand where this is coming from. The individual was, as they would, call themselves, gender critical. And I actually contacted them offline. We had some conversations. I looked into the evidence, etc. And it definitely opened my eyes up, and I had a much better understanding of where that particular individual was coming from. So that's just one example of how you can counter the confirmation bias, is really leaning into listening and then looking, really studying the evidence that individuals hold from the other side, because it is really useful. And it links to one of my favorite sayings at the moment, which is by John Stuart Mill. And the saying is, he who knows only his own position knows little of that. What that basically means is if you only understand your views, your perspective, your argument, do you actually really understand it if you don't really understand the other perspective? So that's just a little bit about confirmation bias. Junior, your comment here, when the tone from the top is, we are not political, but you have strong views on something, but also don't want to leave the company, how do you deal with that internally? I think this is a really good question, Junior. And you know what, Junior, your question on the last, or your comment, I think, on the last LinkedIn Live, where you said about, maybe organizations giving guidance, or certainly giving a steer, saying we don't want to be political, how do you navigate that? It is really tricky. There is something about, it depends on what we mean by we are not political, because what the organization might mean by that is, as an organization, we don't want to put a statement out around that. So there's different degrees to it. So it could mean, as an organization, we don't want to put out a public statement on that particular issue or on certain political issues. And that may or may not be acceptable. If you go back to, I think a really good example is if you rewind back to 2020, and Black Lives Matter, just because there was a lot of stuff going, and there were a lot of organisations that did and didn't, etc., put anything out. And it's the same actually with last summer with the riots. Again, there was a whole debate, I know, within a lot of organisations about should we or should we not say something. And it is kind of down to each organisation. Some of it depends on, for example, I always think if it is a consumer-facing organisation, particularly if it's a kind of like a lifestyle brand. So if, as an organisation, it's a company or a business or an organisation that has a brand that kind of like supports individuals through life, it's seen as a lifestyle brand, we accompany you with your difficult stages of life, then I think then there is potentially more pressure to say something, right? Because if your customers see you as kind of almost like holding their hand and supporting them through life, they potentially will be expecting you to have a view. And there is something about, particularly if you are a consumer-facing brand, more and more customers are wanting to understand the values of the organizations that they deal with, right? So certainly for customer-facing brands, there probably is a lot more pressure actually to say something, even if you think it is political. Interestingly, the Co-op put a statement out last week, well, on the 4th of August, I want to say, a little bit of a press release. And actually, the way I would describe it is they weren't explicitly political, but it was quite activist in its tone. It was kind of like, we are here for human rights, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see more things coming. In fact, I know that when the whole DEI backlash thing happened, the co-op were one of those organisations that explicitly put something out and said, look, this has always been important to us and it will continue to be important to us. So when you look at things like that, the kinds of organisations that were putting statements out during backlash, etc., why were they doing that? You could argue that maybe one or two were being performative, but actually some of them were like, look, this is really important to us in terms of our values, and so that's why we're going to say something. So you have some organizations that either because of their values or because of their relationship with customers, they feel it is important to say something on some of these issues. And so this is really something for the organisation to work out. And I think the role that we can play, or the role that employee network leaders can play, is potentially just, provoking that thought and having those conversations with, like the PR teams, external affairs, legal, etc., sales and marketing, because it does link into that in terms of how the brand is perceived, what customers expect. It could be, so specifically to your point, Junior, I don't know when the last time was that maybe organizations have surveyed customers or surveyed members or clients in terms of understanding, what do our customers expect? Do our customers prefer us to just be quiet on political issues, or actually would they prefer that we say something? Because that's maybe one of the ways to find out with some empirical data, what are our customers expecting from us? If the organization hasn't got any of its own data, I'm going to say, I think the likes of organizations like Mintel in terms of consumer data may have something. I know certainly around 2020, there was a lot of data around, trust that consumers had in organizations, and things like transparency and alignment with values all kind of like links into that. So that's maybe the angle that I would take. I would take the angle of, what is it that our key stakeholders in terms of consumers, clients, members, shareholders, etc., expect of this organization in terms of politics? Do they expect us to stay quiet, or do they expect us to say something? Because I think that, and obviously another stakeholder group is employees, right, colleagues. So when you put all of that in the mix, you hopefully get some guidelines in terms of what is and isn't acceptable. Junior, I hope that clarifies. But it's, we can certainly have more of a conversation offline, if I can, and I see how I can help. One of the other biases that I wanted to talk about here, because what often happens in political conversations, in fact, before I get onto this, I discovered a YouTube video a few days ago that I think it's really useful for you to listen to. It's a TEDx talk by the incredible Kenji Yoshino. I will link it below. Kenji Yoshino is on LinkedIn. Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow, they work at the Meltzer Center for Inclusion and Belonging, based in New York. They're kind of like one of the leading voices around this whole agenda, the whole of like the backlash in the US. Kenji has done a brilliant TEDx talk in the last week. Must be because he knew I had the LinkedIn Live coming up, right? But he's done a brilliant TEDx talk, which is called My Friend on the Other Side. And it really talks through how to disagree respectfully. It's called My Friend on the Other Side because Kenji Yoshino is a lawyer. And one of the things he talks about, why it's called My Friend on the Other Side, he said, in law, when you get up to make an argument, you often refer to the your opposing lawyer, your opposing team, as my friends on the other side. And he was just sort of saying it's a good way of kind of couching the conversation to make sure it stays respectful. But one of the things that I love that he has in this particular talk, he has a scale that he uses of almost like where the source of disagreement is. And this is a great framework for political disagreements, because disagreements can be about things like, personal taste, preferences, policy, do we agree or disagree about policy? And then at the other end of the spectrum, it can be about, equality and like my human rights or my human equality. And this is where, for me, this is where politics, which often sits in policy, interacts with, with the rights of individuals and how we feel we are being treated. That's why it often sits very squarely in the world of like employee networks, in particular for support for underrepresented and sometimes marginalized groups as well. So one of the other biases that I want you to think about as well is something called attribution bias. And what I mean by that is sometimes we assume that if somebody holds a particular view, then they are a certain kind of person, okay? We assume that if somebody holds a particular type of view, they are a certain type of person. And I want to give you an example of that. We sometimes assume that if somebody is pro Black Lives Matter, then that means that they are a, kind of hippie, kind of green loving eco warrior, right? On the opposite side of the spectrum, we sometimes assume that if somebody is not in favor of immigration, that they are racist, right? And we assume that about their whole persona. And it's just not always true. It's part of a bias called an attribution bias. But the reason that I referred to the framework there from Kenji Yoshino, what sometimes happens is, particularly about some of these policy arguments, and I was thinking here particularly about discussions around transgender individuals. Sometimes we think that people are just talking about policy, as in policy around access to, for example, single sex spaces. And this is something I'm going to really go into in a separate video for LGBTQ plus employee network leads. So sometimes we think that the conversation is just policy around access to single sex spaces. For individuals who identify as transgender, they're thinking, look, this is about my very existence. Like, this literally is about my right to exist in the world. And we have to recognize that difference. And when we don't recognize it, it can be a source of incredible pain for some individuals, and what they feel is incredible kind of like disrespect, offensive. They feel as though they're being attacked, etc. So one of my tips, or kind of strategies when you're navigating these political conversations, is kind of recognizing and acknowledging that. So say, for example, if you are in a meeting or just an informal conversation between some colleagues and things get a little bit heated, maybe just take a step back and try to recognize, are both individuals coming at this from the same side? Is one person coming at it in terms of, do you know what, you're literally threatening my very being? And is the other person in another place? And the other person is in like, you have a right to exist, but I'm just talking about policy here in terms of what's the best way of dealing with this particular issue. And actually just calling that out and recognizing that the conversation is in different places for different individuals, that can actually help to really neutralize the conversation, but also recognize the individual's feelings, particularly the person that feels that they are under attack. So that is one of my other tips. Then one of the things I want you to do is to look for common ground, right? This sometimes feels almost impossible. It almost feels impossible to look for common ground, but I guarantee you there will be some common ground. And where that common ground often lives is, first of all, in the desired outcome and the goals or the vision that the individual has. And I mean at the highest level. So if you were to ask why, why do you believe that? Why do you want that? You often end up with a goal that actually, when you take away some of the other kind of arguments around it, is actually kind of okay. You can see where that goal comes from. Because generally most people are good, right? Generally most people want the best. Generally most people don't want harm to other people. So generally, when you ask about why somebody wants something or why somebody thinks something, generally there is a positive there is a positive ambition. So starting with, why do you believe that? Or, what's your ultimate vision? What's your ultimate hope? Kind of gets you to an ambition that you can probably agree with. Where you're disagreeing with is probably the how, right? But the common ground is, where are we trying to get to? And sometimes where you can find common ground is, what do you feel the issues are? So what are your fears? Why is this even an issue? And often that's where you find the common ground. But finding common ground, again, going back to where we started in terms of making friends, getting to know each other, getting to trust each other a little bit more, is incredibly important. And sometimes on some days, you might want to just finish the conversation there. Right, we found some common ground. We're not going to agree on everything else. Let's just leave it there. Okay, so that is something that you can use. The other place that you can potentially find common ground, sometimes depending on where you are in the conversation, is things like definitions. So definitions of the problem, definitions of the data or the analysis. And certainly if this is an ongoing conversation that you can have. So I have friends, as I said, I often disagree on things with my spouse. But if these are conversations that you can continue, and I do think as a society we do need to have more of these conversations, over time you can work through more of the things that you agree on, disagree on, the data that you agree on, the data that you disagree on, why you agree, why you disagree. And the reality is you may never agree. And that's kind of almost like where I'm going to finish up this morning. It's recognizing that you may never agree. And there are reasons why you may never agree on something, because not everything is based on rational decisions. And so my kind of like parting gift, and anybody that knows me offline will know that one of my favorite all-time books that I'm going to recommend to you, particularly if you are navigating these very challenging topics. In fact, I probably should recommend this to every employee network lead. One of my favorite books is a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So I'll just repeat that. It's called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And it's by a writer called Jonathan Haidt, who has written subsequent books since then, but I certainly think that book is his best book. And if you are leading employee networks and you're trying to navigate these sorts of conversations, that book is absolutely incredible in terms of explaining why people hold different opinions, and also why you just may not get everybody to agree. Because actually, a lot of these opinions are based on values, beliefs, morals, things that have been ingrained in us since we were children, things that are linked to our religious beliefs, things that are linked to faith, things that are linked to, our view of the world, that will never change, no matter how much data is presented, right? That is the reality. A lot of these topics, and particularly in certain topics over other ones, and this is something I'm going to go into in a follow-up video, particularly for anybody in the LGBTQ plus community that's looking after those networks, because a lot of topics around sexual orientation, sexuality, lifestyle choice, even things like whether or not people should live together before marriage, right? A lot of these topics are wrapped up in people's beliefs, morals, and values that even if you ask them to explain them rationally, they probably couldn't explain them, right? That's the reality of it. And so sometimes there does come a point where, as Neha, good morning, Neha, I hope you're well, agree to disagree. There is, for a lot of these topics, you are potentially going to reach a point where it's, let's just agree to disagree. Agree to disagree is a common ground. Exactly. Agree to disagree is a common ground. And it's a nice place to meet. And often it's a nice place to end. And it's, I would say, as long as it's said in a way where it's not like agree to disagree and then you kind of, you sort of finish in a huff, right? And you just walk off and you never talk to each other. But agree to disagree. And then maybe you hug, right? Maybe you hug it out and you're like, I look forward to like maybe continuing this conversation, but let's agree to disagree. And I am wrapping it up here. So let me just touch back in the comments. Safia, good morning, Safia. And Safia joined me the last time actually I spoke to a conversation similar to this, which was around how we disagree on LinkedIn in particular. I think we were talking about Safia. We start from, we don't have to have that conversation, but we will be respectful. If someone sets a boundary, we listen. Yeah, absolutely. There is, and there is, definitely the boundary in terms of if you don't even want to have the conversation at all, as I was saying at the top of the conversation, have your phrases ready. Have your phrases ready. Practice them for if you don't want to have the conversation. Have your phrases ready for if you feel that somebody has crossed the line, right? And you need to kind of like shut it down in a way that's respectful. Just have those phrases ready and in your back pocket such that you can literally just pull them out. You're not going to be thrown off guard. They're not going to like ruin your day. You've got your conversations ready to tackle it. And that's it. That's all I'm covering for today. But as I said, there's a lot more. And what I'm going to do, I am going to be, as I explained, I'm going to be literally going through the nitty-gritty of some of the arguments and potentially some of the things that you can say in those arguments for specific employee networks. So I am going to be tackling, I may live to regret this, but I am going to be tackling arguments for the multicultural networks. And I am going to be getting into Israel and Gaza, and I'm going to be getting into immigration and anti-immigration and faith and religion. And I'm going to be tackling LGBTQ plus in terms of, I'm going to be talking about gender in that. I'm going to be talking about how you sort of like navigate between gender and faith and sexual orientation and faith, when it appears maybe that that those rights are at odds. And I'm going to be talking about gender more broadly as well. So I am going to be doing a lot more delving in, not on LinkedIn, because I think LinkedIn is like just maybe a little bit too sanitized as a platform, albeit it's my favorite platform. It's the only one I'm on. But over on my LinkedIn channel, which is specifically for employee networks, which is ERG strategy, I am going to be releasing specific videos with specific guidance around the types of political conversations that come up. So that's it for this morning. Thank you for listening. If you do have any further comments, either drop them in here, but if you want to drop me a DM, and if you want us to have an offline conversation where you've got maybe a specific example or a specific scenario or a specific person, right, that you want help dealing with, get in touch with me and we will work it through. One of the things that Kenji Yoshino says in this video, and I absolutely agree with him, the world that we're moving into, and back to your point, Junior, in terms of organizations that don't want to be political, the world that we're moving into, we don't have a choice. Social media is no longer just social media. It is being used as like a political megaphone, right? So politics is starting to seep into every aspect of our lives. So I am absolutely going to be leaning more into this one. Good morning, Savannah. Good morning, Savannah Hanson. You'll have to watch it on the replay. It's absolutely fine. But yeah, I'm going to be delving more into these, really going in. I'm going to be going in on YouTube on the channel that is called ERG Strategy. Thank you all so much for joining and for your comments. And if you're watching this on the replay, Savannah, you're going to have to catch this on replay. Thank you for spending 43 minutes of your day watching this. Thanks again, Safia. Really lovely to have you. And I will see you all next week. Have a fantastic weekend. Go with grace. And, in these conversations, have these conversations with grace. All right, bye.